multi-tier systems of support, and then an alternative pattern of strengths and weaknesses, which we don't hear about quite as much. For different students in different situations, one of these might be best over either of the other two. It really depends upon the situation. You can't use the same method for every student at every age and stage. Or you can, but you might not get the same information. So one of the advantages of the patterns of strengths and weaknesses, it does align the process of identification with the definition and concept of a learning disability. It identifies why the student is struggling. It helps inform planning of instruction and accommodations. And this is where you can find it in the law. So, Torgerson makes the point that the use of verbal ability as an estimate of reading potential makes sense because children should be able to comprehend what they're reading at a level consistent with their general verbal ability. And if they can't, then it's our job to figure out where's the mismatch. Is it in the assessment tool we used, or is it in the instruction? But we need to figure that out because those should be consistent. The primary purpose for testing should be to find out more about the problem, not just to get a score. And then we have unexpected versus expected underachievement. So, unexpected underachievement would be when academic performance is below expectations based upon some other cognitive, linguistic, and academic ability. So, poor reading performance compared to strong oral vocabulary or math problem solving. So the kid has no trouble with his oral vocabulary, math problem solving, but his reading is much lower. That's unexpected. Expected underachievement would be when we have poor decoding skills and weak phonemic awareness. So weak phonemic awareness skills would predict poor decoding skills. A low reading fluency score would predict, I'm sorry, I'm going to wait for that one. Okay, so I had a hard time deciding what to call this. So I have strong predictors and then I have typical patterns. As my friend Carolyn Gowan says, if you've met one person with dyslexia, you've met one person with dyslexia, because like everybody else, there is no pattern that's exactly the same. So typical is the best I could do here, and it's just saying that many times students with dyslexia, as some of the ones I've talked about, may have strengths in oral language, oral expression, listening comprehension, but some of them may have strengths in listening comprehension and not in oral expression. So these are just suggestions. Comprehension knowledge, their vocabulary, not necessarily what they can read or write, but what they understand. Academic and general knowledge, and fluid reasoning, that problem solving that isn't necessarily taught in school, but novel problem solving. It could be that they have strengths in both inductive and deductive, or only one, nonverbal and or verbal, or perhaps only one. Typical weaknesses would be that core deficit in phonological awareness. The phonemic awareness difficulty is going to be seen in their ability to blend, segment, and manipulate phonemes. Phonological memory, auditory working memory, processing speed. Visual symbol discrimination would be visual processing speed. Naming speed is verbal processing speed. So I'm just reminding you that phonological processing involves phonological memory, phonological awareness, and naming speed. Phonological awareness, then, a subset of that is phonemic awareness, and rudimentary abilities in phoneme blending, phoneme segmentation, and phoneme manipulation are prerequisites for understanding phonics, understanding the place value that GRIL and GIRL, despite the fact that the correct letters are in the middle, it matters, the order. That place value is important, and that's what students learn when they're blending and segmenting and manipulating phonemes. So predictable, see I've changed my word again, but you know where I'm going here. So predictable strengths might be in oral language, general knowledge, academic knowledge, listening comprehension, math concepts, fluid reasoning, and weaknesses, basic reading, academic fluency, and that would include reading, writing, and even math facts, writing mechanics, processing speed, working memory, and phonological processing. in large groups of young adults, and they had these and measures in which there was much emphasis on speediness correlate near zero, perhaps negatively, with tests that require solving difficult problems. So what do we need? Who do we need leading the world, the country? Somebody who goes fast, or somebody who takes the time to solve difficult problems? Sample of college students with LD. Students scored the lowest. This was in the WJ3 because the WJ4 wasn't out yet. Their lowest scores on the WJ academic tests of achievement: phoneme graphing knowledge, which was the pseudo-word decoding, pseudo-word encoding or spelling, and basic reading skills. So real word and non-word identification and spelling, basic writing skills. These are the areas where students with dyslexia scored the lowest. Academic fluency, performance on the academic fluency cluster, and that was reading short sentences and answering very straightforward yes/no questions. That was the reading fluency. Writing fluency, they were given 3 words in a picture and they were supposed to write a short sentence, and they were given a certain amount of time to do that. And math fluency was math facts, addition, subtraction, and multiplication. So performance on the tests in that academic fluency cluster was the single most important variable in differentiating between college students with and without learning disabilities. And this is in your handout. It's just a very tidy bell curve. I know you all have your favorite bell curve, but this is another one you can add to your bell curve collection. And it does include stanines, which some of the other ones have stanines in there, but they're not quite as clearly shown. Oh my. Okay, so I'm talking about this very briefly, but it's important when we're trying to show that the gap is being narrowed for the students that we've assessed and have made recommendations for. And the standard score is important because it gives the student's performance relative to the average performance of age or grade peers. And the standard score can allow direct comparisons between scores from various tests administered and also scores on the same test over time. They tell us about a student's ranking relative to others the same age or grade across the country, and they tell us when a student is narrowing the gap or catching up. We can subtract standard scores from each other. This is a quote from David Kilpatrick. When we hear about evidence-based instruction, we have to stop and ask, by what metric did they define this intervention to be evidence-based? We definitely want to use evidence-based instruction, but we need to know what we're talking about. The answer is statistical significance and or effect size. We need to follow up with one more metric that is the only one useful for determining whether a student is making gains relative to his or her peers. Normative scores, standard scores, and their corresponding percentile rankings. The advantage of standard scores is we can subtract them to get the standard deviation. You can't do that with the percentile, but we all know percentiles, and so we know how to talk about those. The only standard score gains and percentile rankings, only standard score gains and percentile rankings tell us if a student is catching up. Standard scores tell us about a student's ranking relative to other students the same age. If a student is closing the gap with his or her peers, statistical significance and effect size can't do that. They do other things, but they don't do that. So this is just an example of a student. This was an 11-year-old student. He was in the 5th grade. For the second time, I was piloting a special day class in San Francisco Unified School District for gifted students with dyslexia. This student was being tested not because anyone thought he was particularly bright. He was just being tested because they thought he was kind of slow across the board. He had pretty long hair, and he was sitting there with his hair covering up his head, and the psychologist said, "What's wrong if the sun is shining at midnight?" He threw his hair back and put his head. He said, "I need more information. What part of the world is it? What time of the year?" And they started looking at him a little differently. But this is when he could spell the first week of school in the placement in that special day class. And you see that this is a student intellectually gifted, and his standard score for reading was 58, and for spelling was 57. But you also see that he tried. He didn't quit. Even in that second column, you see he was putting what he could hear or what he thought he could figure out about the word. And we stopped after 35. Cruel and unusual punishment only goes so far. So this was the same student. Well, these are the words he was trying to spell, sorry. So in case you didn't know, couldn't tell from what he had there, that's what he was attempting to spell. And in many cases, he did have the correct beginning phoneme. This was 5 months later. Now, his standard score did. This was 2 hours a day, every day, in that special day class of 10. So, his standard score did move, not as much as one would have hoped, but at least he was moving in the right direction. But qualitatively, you see that the mistakes he made were far better. They were better mistakes than before. So, quantitatively, he's making some progress, but not as much as we would like. Qualitatively, we see that he realizes now that every syllable has to have a vowel sound and vowel spelling, and you can tell what a lot of the words are, even the ones that he misspelled. But we had a long way to go. This was another student in the same class. This was a 4th grader, and you see that he was not able to finish the marks in that. That was one thing that most 4th graders like to do, because they could do that in 1 minute. Not only did he not finish it in 1 minute, but he didn't even form some of them correctly. But again, you see how hard he's trying. He put a line if he had no idea. If he had some idea, he did the best he could. But you see here a word beginning with CK. That tells you a lot about his orthographic memory. And you have here where you've got an omission. Here, this is phonetically correct, but he hadn't learned that TURE final stable syllable or the URE suffix. So there are a lot of things he has to learn. That's an understatement. And this was that same student 5 months later. He still didn't finish the marks. But this is a case for direct instruction. We didn't teach him how to make the marks. We did teach him how to write in cursive. And he did use cursive, and you still see some of the same. And he definitely made gains in both reading and spelling, but has a long way to go. But was certainly motivated. Okay, so percentiles, you all know, and the relative proficiency index, you may or may not know, but in the Woodcock-Johnson, it compares a student's level of proficiency to typical age or grade peers. And so you might say that if it's 55 over 90, the student you're assessing would be expected to get 55% when the average student in that grade or that age, it's only grade for this, would have had a 90%. So, grade and age equivalents don't tell us what we think they do sometimes. They are the average score. Okay, I'm going to read. Reflection of the student's grade level or age level in the norming sample, at which the average raw score is the same as the individual score. So they describe nothing more than the correspondence in terms of the number of raw score points obtained between the individual and the average raw score of the age or grade group. And that's important because we can't subtract them the way we often do to say this student made X number of months progress. It's not an equal interval scale. Can't be added and subtracted as raw scores and standard scores can, and it cannot be compared with a student's current grade placement because it's so different from place to place. Cannot be used to measure progress, so we shouldn't do it. So, reliability and validity, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but validity, just you want to make sure the test you're using really measures what it's supposed to measure. And reliability can be looked at in several different ways. Test, retest, is the student going to have similar results? If you did a retest, parallel forms, if you have what are supposed to be alternate forms, they need to be parallel forms, and they need to be reliable in that same way. And if I score the test and one of you scores the test, we should, based upon the instructions in the manual, we should get the same score. Internal consistency would be the items within a particular test. Other factors, how the test is administered, the type of input stimulus. So if a student has a high score on something with a name and a low score on something with the same name, then you need to say, well, what was the difference? Look, what was that task? In this one, in this one he had to write it, and that one he only had to recognize it, but they could both be called spelling. So the type of input stimulus. The degree of integration, remember back in the breadcrumb trail for G, there were a lot of times when he did okay on something as long as he didn't have to integrate one area with another, the visual with the auditory, or the auditory or the visual with the writing. The type of response, what the test measures, subtest scatter. If there's significant differences in subtests within a cluster, then there are going to be areas of strengths and weaknesses. And what the cluster score will give you is an average. You need to see what were the high ones, what were the low ones, why, what was the difference? What were the differences in what the student had to do? What was the difference in how the information was presented? And then look at the nature of those weak areas, the skills needed, and how the strong areas can be used to help remediate or compensate for the weaker ones. I already alluded to this, but when relying on composite or cluster scores, we have to look at all the scores within that cluster. Reliance on just the average may lead to instructional decision-making that isn't correct. In case you didn't get this the first time, I have it back here again. I'm just going to give you an example. Some of the very best tests on the market, if you have a test that has 50 items, and this is normed for students in preschool all the way through adults, some of them are all the way up to age 80, you can't have items for every one of those ages. So a raw score of 20 and a raw score of 21 may give you grade equivalent scores that are years apart, because that's the way it works. But it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the test. It just means we can't use that to, and we can't subtract that and say he got one more word right, therefore he has gained 4.5 years. It would be nice, but it doesn't work that way. Okay, so test results alone aren't going to give us the diagnosis. We have to look at the behavior of the student during the test, watch what strategies they're using, how long it took. Are they sub-vocalizing? Are they writing in the air, writing on the desk? All kinds of things if we look carefully. And all of that information, plus the background information, has to be integrated with the test results. Test results give us useful data, but the experience of the person giving the test and that analysis of behavior and errors, they're the most important factors. And we can't assume going in that we already know what the problem is. As Abraham Maslow said in 1966, I suppose it is tempting if the only tool you have is a hammer to treat everything as if it were a nail. So we have to be careful. We have to stand back and look objectively. Counting errors is necessary, but not sufficient. Analysis of errors. Using the errors to inform planning. When you're looking at a spelling test, which skills have been mastered? Which skills need to be taught? What strategies are being used to accomplish the task? Is the student over-relying on memorization of whole words? Is the student, when reading text, is he guessing what he thinks might make sense, even though the word he said bears no resemblance whatsoever to the word in print? Is the student looking at beginning sounds and ending sounds, with no attention to the middle, which often has the base element, which is the core of the meaning? And note, well, I think I covered that. Okay. So, sometimes an evaluator will say, his decoding is fine. And the teacher or the parent, or I would want to ask, what evidence indicates that his decoding is fine? And the evaluator might say, his word reading score is average, so his decoding is fine. Why? What's the flaw in that conclusion? What that tells me, if he's reading a list of words, it means that he could read enough of those words to get a raw score, which gave him a standard score in the average range for his age or grade. What I want to know is, what did he say for the words he didn't read correctly? That's going to tell me, is he getting the beginning phoneme, not the ending one? Is he guessing from overall context? Is he not dividing the word into syllables? Is he ignoring or not noticing the prefixes and the suffixes? Is he changing endings? There's so much information that I can get from the errors that he made, not just how many he read correctly. And it doesn't tell me that he can decode. It tells me that he has learned enough words to get a raw score that gave him that ranking. And I need to know what he's doing with the words that he so he can do better. So what else do we need to know and why? So, another one. Her problem is her reading fluency. This is the most popular one recently. Please explain her problem with fluency. Her reading rate based on correct words per minute is below average when reading lists of words. Fluency is much more than that. What is the flaw in that conclusion? How accurately is she reading? Yes, she read X number of words accurately, but how many did she read inaccurately within that? How does she tackle unfamiliar content words when reading connected text? That may not be observed during the time that you're doing that test, but it's a question that needs asking if you're saying her fluency, if you're using that one test to describe the fluency. Is she chunking words into meaningful phrases? Does she reread when what she's reading doesn't make sense? That will mean that if she's reading text, she's not going to read as many words correct per minute, but you don't want her to keep reading if what she read didn't make sense. How is her reading comprehension when reading at that below average reading rate? So if she's reading at a reading rate that's slower than we like, she's chunking words into meaningful phrases, and she comprehends at grade level or above, then I don't know that getting her to read faster is necessarily going to be my major goal. Would she like to read faster and comprehend at that level? Yes. But I don't want her to read faster and comprehend less. So, I could do a whole just on that, but okay. So, how is her reading comprehension when reading? And then again, multiple choice, open-ended questions, closure. They're very different tasks, and they tell us very different things. Words of wisdom from a wise teacher. Speed is not the road to success. Careful practice is the road to speed. So, oh my, that one really fast. I don't know where you are now, so I can't, I'm not, oh, there you are, so. Oh, okay. We're gonna have to read this one on your own. DSM, okay. So, DSM has, it has some advantages that the old DSM didn't have, and I'm going to go with what those are. So, faster, Nancy. Okay. So, if a student, sometimes a student isn't diagnosed until later. I'm going to go to this one really. Okay, so reasons for late diagnosis. It actually lists some of these. Sometimes it could be that there was intense remediation outside of school in lieu of special ed, or even in special ed, perhaps without diagnosis or documentation. And so the student did okay up to a point, but may still have a problem that wasn't diagnosed until later. Accommodations provided informally, no paper trail. Teachers may have limited understanding of dyslexia and may think that the kid's just not trying because he's smart, or the learning problems may be blamed on something else. And it also it does talk about twice exceptional students, gifted students with learning disabilities who may have some of these issues and get by in elementary school, and then they hit their brick wall, increased demands as they move up to higher levels in school, but also the workplace, compensatory strategies, and then changing in a provision of accommodations. So, sorry DSM-5, okay. Okay, so students need to understand their strengths as well as their challenges, especially if they're asking for accommodations or need to explain why they need accommodations. They need to practice saying these things. Have you ever studied for a test and thought, yeah, I know that, and the next day when you had to write it, you really didn't know it, and it would have been a good idea to try to say it out loud? So that knowledge allows students to communicate their strengths, minimize their challenges, but not underplay it. Sorry. Harriet Sheridan was the Dean of School of Ed at Brown University. She said that many times college students who have learning disabilities, some of the best students, there's a fire okay, because they know what they need and they plan ahead. So they know that they might need twice as much time, thank you, for reading. They may need to study in the library, even though it would be more fun to study in the room. And they may need to have 3 or 4 drafts. This is the definition of dyslexia, which we're going to go right on by, because I'm going to, well, I can't go all the way by. The third bullet Dyslexia is focusing on accurate and or fluent word recognition, poor spelling, and poor decoding with that phonological component as the core deficit, and it's often unexpected. The oral and written language disability that Virginia Berner talks about, the specific language impairment, that often may be also in a student with dyslexia. Dysgraphia, the impaired handwriting, can interfere with written spelling, also with speed of writing, or both. So, dyscalculia, which is the math, which you can read in your handout. I'm going to show you in a second a couple of examples. So, the hallmark signs then of dyslexia: lack of efficient strategies for accurate word identification, especially unfamiliar words, persistent spelling problems, weak phonemic awareness, listening comprehension that exceeds reading comprehension, slow naming speed, sometimes limited awareness of syntax and grammar. That may not show up at all in oral language. It may only show up when they have to chunk words into meaningful phrases for reading. And those deficits in word retrieval. So, do people with dyslexia see things backwards? No. And all I'm going to say about that is this a cup? Is this a cup? Is it still a cup? A B, a D, a P, and a Q don't change any more than that cup did, but the cup is still a cup, and the B, the D, and the P, and the Q have different names. So it's that label for a letter or group of letters. And again, an inefficiency in that visual to auditory. Okay, so this is, I'm going to have to paraphrase this really quickly, but we're talking here about reading. She tries her best to read the word, volcano. It's and over here she's saying no self-respecting student of most of us would say what would they say? Right? But she didn't know that. Okay, so gives up, resorts to relying on the picture context, and what does she say? Tornado. Teacher wonders if it's a vocabulary problem. It isn't. She knows what a volcano is, but she guessed from context. And I had a lot more to say about that, but I don't have time. So, less skilled readers are more dependent on context. Word recognition process for skilled readers is so rapid and automatic that they need not rely on context. Good readers apply that contextual information more fluently, not more often. So, context clues help skilled readers to predict pronunciation, but context is not used as a primary strategy. Context enables the reader to predict accurately 1 out of 4 words overall, and the content words only 10% of the time. That's not a good return on the investment. So, and the content words are less common, not the sight vocabulary, often unfamiliar because we have so many of them and must be decoded accurately. So the moral of the context story, every story has a moral. Context is not useful when it's most needed. Which readers depend on it? The ones who don't have any other strategy. And I wanted to have you read this and guess all the missing words from context, because some of you might not believe me about context. You would when you finish trying to read this, but onward, okay? So, the recommendations from an assessment need to include remediation, accommodations, and a discussion of compensatory strategies, because some compensatory strategies that students are using, like guessing from context and whole word memorization, are not going to be useful in time at some point. And these are, it's crossed out because even then I knew I wouldn't have time. These are examples of remediation, and one of the areas of remediation, as you see, was grammar and syntax. Some people think teaching grammar is cruel and unusual punishment, but this was from a 7th grade student. The last time I was going to be seeing him, he was reading a Greek myth. He read it beautifully, fluently, and I complimented him. And he looked up at me as only a cool 7th grader can. No, Ms. White, once you know those prepositions, you can see them coming. I couldn't have asked for a better quote. Okay, so remediation and accommodation, not accommodations without remediation. And this is an example of a high school student. It's a 9th grader on the first day of a 4-week summer school. This was his single word spelling. This was his attempt to write phrases. This was his attempt to write sentences. And this was 4 weeks later. This was his attempt to write those words. There was a big emphasis. Certainly he learned grapheme, phoneme, and syllables, but he also learned morphology. And so you can see he still is having some confusion here with that SCI base element, and you'll see that when he was writing phrases, he's confusing the CISE, CIDE base with SCI, but he's come a long way, he's learned a lot. He still has more to learn. I was going to give you a little morphology lesson here, but we don't have time. Okay, so accommodations. Okay, at the university. These were great ideas. Okay, compensatory strategy that is very useful for many, not just kids, but also adults, and some of us do it and maybe not even realize it, and that is sub-vocalizing or reading aloud. And the research is supporting why we're doing that. And so we don't want to discourage students. So as you see here, he doesn't move his lips when he moves his lips when he thinks, and he yells when he reads. But you don't have to yell, but you definitely, and it is something that's useful, and many students do it. And they do it because it helps them, and they shouldn't be discouraged from doing it. I'm sorry, I'm probably driving you crazy right now going so fast, but the only way I can get to the other pieces. So, I am going to make my last point on this. All compensatory strategies are not created equal. Guessing from context for identification of unfamiliar words when reading text. When does it work? When does it seem to work? Why do students and too often parents and teachers believe it's an effective strategy? Because it seems like kids are comprehending by doing it, but they get to a point when they're reading academic area text where the words they haven't seen before. You can only do that if you know the word already, either in your oral vocabulary or your reading. So when does it